Hi, everyone. My name's Chris, and I'm an alcoholic. And thank you to the group for asking us to do this tonight. We get so much out of carrying the message, and we're not gurus. We don't know everything. We've just got some IT experience. And so we're just going to show some pictures. But everything that you see tonight will be straight out of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we'll be sharing some of our story and give you some other illustrations as well, or examples. But I'll pass you over to David and we'll get going.
Okay. Hi, my name's David. I'm an alcoholic. This is a workshop we've been doing for quite a while around AA and then conventions and rehabs and stuff like that. So this is the 12 steps. I want to quickly recap the first three before we get to step four, just so we know why we're here. So step one, I drank for 17 years, and the last 3 of those years I was trying to stop drinking, and I'd failed multiple detoxes and hospitalizations. I ended up homeless in a little tiny rehab in Bendigo, where part of the rules were you have to go to AA. It's a long time ago. I was 34 at the time. So I didn't have the white beard. I was a lot thinner, and I was very sick at the time. And I went to these meetings and identified with the problem really quickly. They talked about one side is the physical side of it. When I drink alcohol, I get a physical craving to keep going and keep going. I'd known about that for a long time. And because I kept on drinking, it then took over my life and started causing all sorts of problems. In the end, it becomes a physical dependency as well. It's not just after I start drinking, I get a craving, I then become physically dependent. But then I kept on trying to stop, and I would stop for a period of time, do a detox. And then I discovered the other part of the illness is this obsession. So that even though I would stop for a while, and after doing the detox, life would tend to get better, but the obsession, the thought, the urge to go back and do it again would keep on coming back. And I eventually do the insane thing of picking it up again, knowing that I was an alcoholic, having made a decision not to drink. Sometimes I had an excuse, sometimes I wouldn't have an excuse. Sometimes I just forget about what was going to happen, even though I fully well knew what would happen if I started drinking again. So I quickly identified with step one. Came into AA, and for the first time in ages, I got some hope. People talked about if I'm powerless, they suggested I come to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So I needed an open mind. It was nice that I got to choose my own conception of this higher power. And this step comes from inspiration. I met people who had recovered from this illness, people who were just like me, who were powerless over alcohol, but had recovered. And they were basically sitting around. The main meeting I went to, my home group, was a bunch of people sitting around a table there in Bendigo, reading from the AA Big Book and saying, this is my experience with the illness and with the solution. So that's the promise that I can be restored to sanity. That's step two. And then I come to a decision. Okay, I know I'm powerless. I've been offered a way out through a spiritual program, and I need to make a decision in step three, a decision to try and live by some spiritual principles and go on with the rest of the program. Then we get these middle steps, often known as the house cleaning steps, where I have to get off my bum and actually do some work, some of which I balk at. But where I really want to get to is the last three, because by the time I get to step 10, sanity has returned. I'm no longer obsessing about alcohol. I'm no longer doing the insane thing of picking up a drink, the insane thing of relapsing and relapsing. But before we get there, that's where I want to get to. I want to be restored to sanity. And so there's this process, a series of spiritual exercises that we go through to bring about that change. And so that's where we're going to start with that decision, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. And it ends with this. This is the big book. This is the last bit of step three.
Next, we launched out on a course of vigorous action, the first step of which is a personal house cleaning, which many of us had never attempted. Though our decision was a vital and crucial step, it could have little permanent effect unless at once followed by a strenuous effort to face and to be rid of the things in ourselves which had been blocking us. Our liquor was but a symptom, so we had to get down to causes and conditions.
If you want to follow along in your book, that's on page 63. What I like about that, it says that this third step is vital and crucial, but has little permanent effect unless at once followed by some action. And I want the permanent effect. I really wanted to stay sober. I knew when I left that little rehab I was in, I was going to relapse, because that's what always happened. I'd get sober for a little while and relapse. But I was offered this way out, and so I launched into the action. So what's the action that I take? It's this next step, step 4, where we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Lots of us balk, and I found a couple of reasons we balk. One is fear. I don't want to look at myself. The other one is pride. I'm not that bad. But the other reason some of us balk at this is it's really confusing. I've never done this before. I don't know how to do that. So these next few pages describe how the first 100 members took inventory, and that's what we'll go through.
Therefore, we started upon a personal inventory. This was step 4. A business which takes no regular inventory usually goes broke. Taking commercial inventory is a fact-finding and fact-facing process. It is an effort to discover the truth about the stock in trade. One object is to disclose damaged or unsaleable goods, to get rid of them promptly and without regret. If the owner of the business is to be successful, he cannot fool himself about values. We did exactly the same thing with our lives. We took stock honestly. First, we searched out the flaws in our makeup which caused our failure. Being convinced that self, manifested in various ways, was what had defeated us, we considered as common manifestations.
So it's a fact-finding and fact-facing process, an effort to discover the truth about ourselves. And it's talking about, we've just in the third step in that last few pages, reading about the core problem being selfishness and self-centeredness. For most people, not just alcoholics, most people live life on a selfish, self-centered basis. But what was great is these guys back then discovered that if an alcoholic deliberately and consciously takes a different path in life and tries to take a spiritual path in life, a pretty rare thing in the world, that alcoholics get sober when they do that. So the thing about stopping drinking, I was really good at stopping because I stopped it. I did it over and over again, and I knew where to get help and do detoxes and things. But then, and whenever I stopped drinking, life tended to get better because I'm showing up to work on time and I'm not hungover and I'm not lying to the people around me. So they're getting their trust back in me. My health's improving. I've got more money in my pocket. So life gets better, but at the same time, there can be a whole lot of negative stuff going on in my head. A whole lot of anger and resentment and blaming everybody else. I wouldn't be like this if she hadn't have left me or that guy hadn't have sacked me. A whole lot of fear about the future. What am I going to do if something really bad happens in life and I can't turn back to my old friend alcohol? And a whole lot of guilt and remorse about the people that I've hurt and the bridges that I've burnt. So I'm trying to stay sober. I want to go on this new spiritual path to stay sober. My head, racing around in my head is all this negativity. And it's pretty hard to live this new spiritual life and trying to help the next person if I'm just full of negativity. So this is about working out what needs to change, what negativity I need to get rid of. And the first thing it suggests I look at is this one.
Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease, for we've been not only mentally and physically ill, we've been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. In dealing with resentments, we set them on paper.
So the first thing it suggests we look at is resentments. I think it's a great place to start because, as it says, number one offender, one of the biggest reasons for relapse in early times is that when we're first starting to stop drinking, is that I'm just angry at the world. And it's pretty hard to get on with this spiritual program if I'm just thinking about how angry I am and blaming the rest of the world. The other reason I think it's a great place to start is it's a really easy place to start because most of us, when we're early around, the things that I'm angry about come to mind pretty quickly, pretty easily. Now, you notice as Chris reads through page 64, right, most of it's highlighted in yellow, and the parts we've highlighted in yellow describe why we need to do it and what to expect along the way. But in amongst that, we've highlighted certain sentences in blue. Now, these are the sentences we've picked out. These are the statements about this is what we did. Now, remember, this book was written when the first 100 members got sober. So what was said to me as I was going through this process of taking the fourth step, they said, if you come across a sentence that said, this is what we did, you should treat that as an instruction and you should do the same thing. So the first instruction that I get is, in dealing with resentments, we set them on paper. That's what they did. So that's what I need to do. I need to set it on paper. Now, these days, I know some people we're used to doing writing on computers or on iPhones even, and I reckon some sponsors might say, no, you've got to write it out by hand. But maybe I'm not that strict. But as long as I can get it out of my head and onto a piece of paper or onto a device where I can put it aside for a moment and come back to it and read it back to myself. So how do I start this fourth step? Pretty simple. I start with a blank piece of paper and a pen. Now, I've got the book to refer to that gives me these instructions, but also by this time I've probably got a sponsor. If I haven't, good idea to get one, or at least someone who's been through this process and that can just answer some questions, the technical side of it. What do I do next? What do I do next? Because although it's all there in the big book, it helps if someone else who's been through it can actually point out, this is the bit, now do this. The other thing to remember about this step, as with every step, is that it's a spiritual exercise. So I can start this process with a prayer to whatever higher power I've chosen, just to put myself into the right frame of mind. So the prayer can be a simple prayer: God help me to be honest, fearless, and thorough. Okay, I'm ready to go. I've just taken the third step. I've got my piece of paper and a pen. I've got someone I can call up if I need some advice or direction. And what do I need to do?
We listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we're angry.
So this is pretty simple. I'm going to make a list of people and things that I'm angry at. Think of the person in the world that you're most angry at, and you write that person's name down on the piece of paper. So in my example, I'll put down my employer. Now, at the moment, I don't need to think too deeply about that, why that person's name came to mind. We're just going to write the name down and then think of another name. So Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, my next door neighbour, Jack from the pub gives me the shits. I think back through time, and I remember that high school science teacher when I was 14 embarrassed me in front of the class, and I still remember how that felt, and it's still all that sort of thing. So all that time ago, think through time, and then can be people close to me, like my wife or my sister-in-law. It mightn't be an individual person, could be a group of people, say the police or the taxation department. It might actually be not a person, but a principle. An example like speed limits. Now, everyone else should obey the speed limits, but I'm a really good driver and I don't like being late and I don't like being fined. Speed limits shouldn't apply to me. When I say it out loud, it sounds ridiculous, but in my head, that's a real resentment. Or say tax laws. And I keep on thinking of names until I can't think of any more. I put down my mother, bad drivers. And for some people, this is a really long list, and for other people, it can be quite short. I know one lady whose whole list was 8 people. This was her big resentments. Another guy I know, after one of these workshops, said to me he had 280 people on his list. This is someone who worked all over the world and hated everyone he met. So
Hated him before they met.
Probably hated them before he met them. Very angry guy, but he had this really long list. But each of us have our own list, and we just write down the names, and then we can check in with a higher power. Is that it? Is that all I've got? Okay, and now I've finished that list, and I can check in with my sponsor if I've got, or check in with someone and say, now I've finished my list. What do I do with it? And refer back to the book.
We asked ourselves why we were angry.
Okay, so now I'm going to have a look at each one of these, and I'm going to get an exercise book and rule it up like this. The first column is going to be who I'm resentful at. And the second column will be the cause, what this person did. Now, notice I'm going to leave a whole lot of space on the right-hand side blank. So these two columns are right over on the left-hand side and leave all that space. But one by one, I take the names off my first list. It doesn't matter what order I do them in, just as long as I do them all. But I've got a complete list. I've got a finite list. But I'll grab one of them. Mr. Brown, what's the cause? Don't like the way he pays attention to my wife. He told my wife about my mistress. Brown may get my job at the office. So all good reasons not to like Mr. Brown. Notice I'm not writing paragraphs and paragraphs and trying to psychoanalyze this guy or all the nitty-gritty details of it. They're just like headlines in a newspaper, not the whole article, just the headline. In my head, it seems like pages of stuff that he's done to me. But when it comes to writing it down, it's just 3 sentences there, 17 words about this Mr. Brown. So once I've got those basic things down about what he did in my exercise book, I can cross off the first name, the name off the first list, and grab another name. So Mrs. Jones, she's a nut. She snubbed me. She committed her husband for drinking and he's my friend, and she's a gossip. So good reasons not to like Mrs. Jones. Cross her off the list, grab another name. So my employer, unreasonable, unjust, overbearing, and he's threatening to fine me for drinking and padding my expense account. Cross him off the list, grab another name. So my wife misunderstands and nags and likes Brown and wants to put the house in her name. And I continue on taking those names one by one, putting them in those first two columns. Now, I like to say with a little exercise book, just put 2 per page, really. Leave a lot of space for later on. Certainly leave the whole of the right-hand side empty. Once I've got them all into my exercise book, I can throw the first piece of paper away. I don't need that anymore. And I go back to the book and say, what do I need next?
In most cases, it was found that our self esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our personal relationships, including sex, were hurt or threatened. So we were sore, we were burned up. On our grudge list, we set opposite each name our injuries. Was it our self esteem, our security, our ambition, our personal or sex relations which had been interfered with?
So the next column we're going to look at is how this other person's actions have affected me. And it's given us a bunch of key words to look for. Was it our self-esteem, our security, our ambitions, our personal or sex relations, which have been interfered with? New column, what part of me was affected? This is pretty simple in that all I'm doing is going through each one and picking out one or more of those key words. So Mr. Brown, his attention to my wife, that's affected my sex relations and my self-esteem. There's fear associated with that because I'm worried, how come she likes him better than she likes me? And there's fear that she might actually run off with him. He told my wife about my mistress. That's affected my sex relations. That's why I'm sleeping in the back room. And my self-esteem. I didn't want people to know about that secret that I had, that secret affair. Brown may get my job at the office. That's affected my security because if he gets my job, I might be demoted or even out of a job. Also my self-esteem. How come he's getting promoted and I'm not? And there's fear associated with the security there. Mrs. Jones, that's affected my personal relationship with her. I don't like being snubbed by people. Also my self-esteem. My employer, that's affected my self-esteem. How come he's treating me this way? And my security, because he's threatened to sack me. Okay, that's that roof over my head, sort of money in my pocket type security. The wife, that's affected my pride and my personal and sex relations with her. And also the part about wanting the house in her name is affecting my security. So as I said, this is a really simple column. We just keep it really simple. Just pick out one or more of the relevant key words. But I think that it's actually quite useful in that it starts to shift the focus. The first 2 columns, there's no new information. I don't really learn anything new from the first 2 columns. I already know who it is that I hate and I know what they did to me. But in the end, I want to learn something about myself. So this column starts shifting the focus away from the other person and onto me. And so as we move on from here, I can start learning something about myself. That example so far, that's on page 65. So Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, the employer and the wife, that's straight out of the big book. So I'll point out that this isn't my personal inventory. I wouldn't put my personal inventory on a screen for the world to see, okay? So this is just this person, this fictitious guy out of the book. It's not me. But from the book only takes the example to that 3rd column. So from here on in, what we're going to show you is our best guess about what this guy in the book might have put into the next part of this inventory. And we'll follow through the book as it tells us what to do.
We went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. When we were finished, we considered it carefully. The first thing apparent was that this world and its people were often quite wrong. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. The usual outcome was people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse and then we were sore at ourselves. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were short-lived. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to fertility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. But with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal. But when harbouring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the spirit. The insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again, and with us to drink is to die. If we were to live, we had to be free of anger. The grouch and the brainstorm were not for us. They may be the dubious luxury of normal men, but for alcoholics, these things are poison.
So this really explains how dangerous resentments are. It's saying any life, whether you're alcoholic or not, anyone living a life full of anger and resentment is going to have a pretty horrible life. But for an alcoholic, it's even worse, more dangerous, because if I stay that way, if I'm not able to get onto this new spiritual way of life, this spiritual path, then I'll eventually pick up a drink again, and to drink is to die. So what's a resentment? A resentment is every time I think about a particular person, I start thinking about that person, I start thinking about all the nasty things they did to me in the past. And then I start re-feeling that hurt from when that person said whatever they said to me or whatever they did to me. And I start re-feeling it, which is what that third column is about, how it affected me. Now, normally my next thought is, this guy's a bastard, isn't he? And he did all those nasty things to me. Those are the things in that second column. And it hurt me, and the bastard. And he did all those nasty things to me, and it hurt me, the bastard. And round it goes in my head. And the longer I think about it, the worse he gets. He's just this bastard that's picking on me. And the more innocent I get, I didn't do anything wrong. And I rerun it over on my head. When he said that, I should have said this. And I start praying that he gets hit by a bus. And then I start thinking about the next time he's critical of me, I'm really going to tell him what I really think, and identifying this is a resentment going round and round in my head. And when I'm in or any time in recovery, if that's going round and round in my head, it's a dangerous place to be, because what can happen is I get this other little pleasant thought, well, look, if I have a couple of drinks, I'll be able to forget about him for the night. Now, maybe that works for people who aren't alcoholics. Okay, just have a couple of drinks and I can sleep better. He's sleeping soundly at home. I'm lying awake going around in my head. So it becomes this really dangerous thing. And it's stopping me from moving forward into this new way, this sober way of life. I'm stuck back in that anger. So we need to get out of that and learn something about ourselves.
We turn back to the list as it held the key to the future. We are prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had power to actually kill. How could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered, but how? We could not wish them away any more than alcohol. This was our course. We realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way these disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended, we said to ourselves, "This is a sick man, how can I be helpful to him? God save me from being angry, thy will be done." We avoid retaliation or argument. We wouldn't treat sick people that way. If we do, we destroy our chance of being helpful. We cannot be helpful to all people, but at least God will show us how to take a kindly and tolerant view of each and every one.
So it suggests we turn back to the list. And now this time we're going to try and take a different attitude to that person and realize that, like us, other people are perhaps spiritually ill as well. And it says the action that I take is I'm going to ask my higher power something. So it's suggesting that I say a prayer for each person. So at this point, I can put the pen down. I don't need to write anything in this part, but I go through my list one by one, and I can say that prayer for that person. So I think about Mr. Brown. God save me from being angry. How can I be helpful to him? And I think about Mrs. Jones. God save me from being angry. How can I be helpful to her? And I think about my employer, and perhaps through gritted teeth, reluctantly, God save me from being angry at the bastard. I'm going to say it as a spiritual exercise, okay? I'm going through it. This is what the book is suggesting I do. How can I be helpful to him? And I think about my wife. God save me from being angry. How can I be helpful to her? And this is an interesting part, the reminder that this whole exercise is a spiritual exercise, not a psychological exercise, not an intellectual exercise. It's a spiritual exercise. Sometimes as we're writing that second column, I write down the name and I've written down the cause and I read it back to myself. And some of these resentments, I see how ridiculous and petty some of them are from all those years ago. And just writing it down and reading it back, that process in itself, they just disappear. I think, why am I still worried about that? Others are a bit tougher than that. And it's when I say this prayer that the resentment starts to lift. Others are even tougher still. And this fourth step isn't going to fix them. I think it might have some justification for them. But remember, this fourth step isn't the whole process. This is just the very beginning of the housekeeping process. But in this step, I'm acknowledging this and I'm writing it down, and that prepares me for the rest of the house cleaning steps. Some of these resentments mightn't be lifted until I've done a fifth step, or a sixth step, and the seventh step, the eighth step, and some of them until I've done a ninth step. But at least I've made a start on this new spiritual way of life by saying a prayer for every person on that list. Good thing to remember, don't leave that bit out. Don't jump on to the next bit before, the book says to go through it one by one and say that prayer. And then once I've done that, we go back again.
Referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight.
So now we go back through the list, and now I'm going to look for something that I'd never looked for before. I'm going to look for my mistakes. I was very good at picking out someone else's mistakes, but now I'm looking for my mistakes. In fact, two things I'm looking for. My mistake, what did I either do or fail to do that contributes to this resentment? And the second thing is our faults, like an underlying defect of character. And it's given us some key words again to look for. Where have we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking and frightened? They're the four key words I'm looking for. So I go back through my list one by one and say, okay, Mr. Brown, his attention to my wife. What's my mistake? I've been neglecting my wife. And I'll give it one of those labels. Okay, I was being selfish. Now, it could be that Mr. Brown's doing the wrong thing. He's a sleazy guy trying to move in on my wife, and he shouldn't be doing what he's doing. But I'm putting that out of my mind and saying, well, what's my mistake? I'm down the pub getting drunk all the time. I'm not home, and that's given him the opportunity to do what he's doing. On the other hand, he mightn't be a sleazy guy. He just might be a nice guy. Occasionally has a cup of coffee with my wife because she's lonely because I'm down the pub all the time. So it's not about his actions. I'm looking for my mistakes. Notice it says here, my mistakes. It doesn't say my part. Nowhere in the book does it say I'm looking for my part. I'm looking for my mistake. And when I realize that, there's a difference between those things. I'm looking for my mistake. If I was saying my part, then I'm still putting some of the blame over there. I'm looking for my mistake, which may have happened before or after whatever happened that person did. He told my wife about my mistress. My mistake, that one's really obvious. I was unfaithful. So I give it a label. I was being dishonest. Brown may get my job at the office. I was looking after my own interests rather than doing my job properly. So I was being self-seeking. Mrs. Jones, she's a nut. She snubbed me. I was inconsiderate to her. Perhaps I came home late at night one night, drunk, singing at the top of my voice, slamming car doors. She's a next door neighbour. I've woken her up. And next day I saw her on the street and waved at her. And she didn't wave back at me, the cow. She snubbed me. So I have a resentment against her for a couple of weeks over that.
Okay, for years.
She committed her husband for drinking, and he's my friend. Now, what's that got to do with me? Surely that's between her and her husband. I'm afraid that might happen to me. My fear of that happening to me is being triggered by what's happening next door. So I'm frightened. And she's a gossip. Now, maybe she is the neighbourhood gossip, telling tales all over the place. What's my mistake? I've done things I don't want other people to know about. She knows about them because she's the next door neighbour, but I'm really scared of her telling everyone about those secrets. So I'm being dishonest. My employer, unreasonable, unjust, overbearing. I was unreliable. He's threatened to fire me for drinking and padding my expense account. I was doing the things he's accusing me of. Here I am, I'm getting a resentment against him for calling me out on it. So I'm being dishonest. The wife misunderstands and nags, likes Brown. I don't pay enough attention to her. Wants the house in her name. I put my job in jeopardy by drinking and stealing. So she's just looking after her own security and possibly mine by wanting the house in her name in case I go bankrupt and we don't want to lose the house. Being dishonest. In this way, I start to see something about myself. And you notice as we did this, the first thing we did, we made the list. We didn't move on to the second column until we had that complete list of names. Then we went down the column and worked out the cause. We went down the column, worked out what part of me was affected. We went down the column and said a prayer for each person. We went down the column and worked out my mistake. And the reason I think that's really useful and helpful to do down the column is that when I get there, it seems to be easier to put out of my mind what the other person had done, but it also reveals a whole lot of patterns. There it is again, my mistake, same thing. That's the way I treat other people. That's the way I react to other people. And I can start to see that pattern in me. And each of us will have a unique pattern. Well, we're all different. There's no such thing as an alcoholic personality. Look around AA. There's all different people. So we're going to have different patterns and different ways of behaving. But we discover this for ourselves. This is one of the great things about this fourth step is it tailors the rest of the house cleaning steps, particularly to me. All the steps, the process is the same for everyone, but the details, the particulars are different because we've all lived different lives, met different people, done different things. And this process, this inventory is going to follow us through step 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 and tailor the whole spiritual experience to my life in particular. So there's my resentment list.
Notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, the employer, and the wife. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? Sometimes we think fear ought to be classed with stealing. It seems to cause more trouble. We reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper even though we had no resentment in connection with them.
So the next thing we look at is a list of fears. And again, it says we put it on paper. So get my piece of paper. I can start making a list of fears. Where do I get this list from? Actually, when I did the resentment list, I identified a whole lot of fear. So basically, I can read through that resentment list, and where I see that there's a fear involved, then I can give that fear a name. So there's fear that my wife will leave. There's a fear of being lonely if the wife leaves and I lose the mistress as well. There's a fear of failure. There's a fear of the people will find out about the things that I've done that I'm ashamed of. There's a fear of confrontation with my boss and probably other people on my resentment list. So there's a fear of financial insecurity. So there's the start of my resentment list. Again, our fears list. Again, this bit we're guessing on what this guy might have put in here. This isn't directly out of the book, but it's sort of an example. Each of us are going to be different with these things. And then I can add, are there any other fears that I have that sort of didn't come up? Resentments. Okay, fear of meeting new people, fear of success. So once again, some people it's a long list, other people it's short. Some people have lots and lots of resentments, really angry people, not so many fears. Other people, not so many resentments, but lots and lots of fears. We're each unique in that sense. But I've got that list of fears, and once again, I can refer back to a sponsor or get that advice and go back to the book.
We asked ourselves why we had them. Wasn't because self-reliance failed us. Self-reliance was good as far as it went, but it didn't go far enough. Some of us once had great self-confidence, but it didn't fully solve the fear problem or any other. When it made us cocky, it was worse.
So now we're going to ask ourselves why we have each of these fears. So this column, second column, why do I have this fear? And the previous page said we did something to set the ball rolling. So to me, this is a very similar column to the fourth column in the resentment list. I'm looking for my mistakes. And there might be some repetition from what I wrote down about the resentments. I've been neglecting my wife. My selfishness has screwed up relationships in the past. That's why I'm worried I end up with no one. I give up before the job is done. I've hurt people and stolen stuff. I don't stand up for my principles. I've been reckless. I have prejudices. I try to be self-reliant rather than trusting in my higher power. So once again, I've looked at myself, and then this is what the book says, what we do then.
Perhaps there is a better way, we think so, but we are now on a different basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. We're in the world to play the role He assigns, just the extent that we do as we think He would have us, and humbly rely on Him. Does He enable us to match calamity with serenity? We never apologize to anyone for depending upon our Creator. We can laugh at those who think spirituality a way of weakness. Paradoxically, it is a way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. All men of faith have courage. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. We ask Him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what He would have us be. At once, we commence to outgrow fear.
There's a little promise there. That's the beginning of outgrowing fear. And what's the instruction? We're going to ask our higher power something again. So the instruction is to once again say a prayer. At this point, again, not necessarily need to write anything down, but it's certainly something I can think about. With a lot of these prayers, there's two parts. We ask God to do something, and then we ask Him, what do you want me to do? In this case, I'm asking God to remove the fear and then show me what He would have me be. So I can say that prayer, and I might want to write this down as well, but I think about each one of them and say, my higher power wants me to be faithful to my wife, wants me to be loving, wants me to be hopeful, wants me to be honest, wants me to be courageous, wants me to be responsible, wants me to be compassionate, wants me to be humble. Now, this process can actually be a really uplifting exercise to write these things down. Think about what I want to be in the future, because that's what fear is all about. Fear is all about the future. Resentment is all about the past. It's stuff from the past that's still affecting us now. It's all that's in the past, whereas fear is always about the future. Fear is what I'm worried is going to happen in the future, usually based on past experience, but it's all about the future. Now, remember, at this point in the program, I've just made this third step decision, this decision to try and take a spiritual path in life, to live a sober spiritual life, to live the AA program. I've made that really big decision. What would life be like if that was the case, if I continue down this path? What sort of person do I want to be? What sort of person does my higher power want me to be, instead of the person and the type of behavior that I've been doing in that second column? It's this really uplifting thing when I can do this, look to the future in a different way, remembering that's what I used to be like, but now I'm on this new path. So that's our fears list, but we need to go further.
Now about sex. Many of us needed an overhauling there. But above all, we tried to be sensible on this question. It's so easy to get way off the track. Here we find human opinions running to extremes, absurd extremes perhaps. One set of voices cry that sex is a lust of our lower nature, a base necessity of procreation. Then we have the voices who cry for sex and more sex, who bewail the institution of marriage, who think that most of the troubles of the race are traceable to sex causes. They think we do not have enough of it, or that it isn't the right kind. They see its significance everywhere. One school would allow man no flavour for his fare, and the other would have us all on a straight pepper diet. We want to stay out of this controversy. We do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. We all have sex problems. We'd hardly be human if we didn't. What can we do about them? We reviewed our own conduct over the years past. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? Whom had we hurt? Did we unjustifiably arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Where were we at fault? What should we have done instead? We got this all down on paper and looked at it.
So the next thing we look at is our sex conduct. We look at our intimate relationships. Now, I know that intimate relationships are the source of some of the greatest joy in our lives, but when they go wrong, some of the greatest pain. So I can learn a lot about myself by looking at each of these relationships. Goes to great lengths to point out that AA isn't trying to be the judge or the arbiter of this. It's not about what AA thinks about my sex life or my sponsor or my mother or my priest. It's about what I think. but it does say it's a searching and fearless moral inventory. And the word moral in there to me means that I need to make an assessment of my behaviour based on my values, not being told what to do by someone else, but have a look at the way I've been treating other people based on my values and see where I could have done something different in a lot of ways. So I'm going to need another list, and this is my list of relationships. So again, this is not my personal list. This is a fictitious guy out of the book, okay? There might be some similarities, but no, that first girlfriend, Barry's girlfriend, that fling I had in 1994, the wife and the mistress. And again, for some people, it's a really long list. For other people, it's short, it's quite short. For some people, it's alarmingly long. For other people, it's disappointingly short.
And that's his only joke.
But it's our own list. It's our own private list. And then the book gives us a bunch of questions to ask ourselves about each of these relationships. So who did I hurt? Did I arouse jealousy, suspicion, or bitterness? Where was I selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate? I'm looking for those three key words: selfish, dishonest, or inconsiderate. Where was I at fault? So once again, I'm looking for my mistakes. And really interesting question, what should I have done instead? So that first girlfriend, what caused all the arguments and the eventual breakup of that relationship? So I threatened to dump her if she didn't have sex more often. That was the big issue in that relationship. So I think about that, give it a label. Okay, I was selfish. And what could I have done differently? What should I have done instead? I should have respected her wishes. Barry's girlfriend flirted with her, caused jealousy, hurt Barry as well. So I was inconsiderate. Probably should have considered their relationship. I think about those things based on my values and say, what could have been done differently? The fling in 1994, don't remember her name, but I lied to her about my intentions, so I'm being dishonest. And I was lying to get something out of the relationship. Who knows, if I had been honest, it might have happened anyway. But so I should have been honest with her. Now, not all relationships end up badly. If you've got a relationship that's great, then say so. But given that alcoholism causes me to become more and more dishonest and let people down, and I lie to people and I break promises, all of that, I'm not naturally like that. But as alcoholism takes over my life, alcohol becomes more important than these relationships. And I become that way. So this one started out great, but ended up being inconsiderate and unfaithful, caused suspicion and bitterness. So I'll give it a label. I was selfish and I was inconsiderate and I was dishonest. So all three labels for that one. And again, I think about what I could have done differently. Should have spent more time with her, listened to her, certainly should have been faithful. The mistress, I lied to her about being married, being dishonest, probably shouldn't have started that relationship in the first place. So by looking at that, by looking at the past, then we can look to the future.
In this way, we tried to shape a sane and sound ideal for our future sex life. We subjected each relation to this test. Was it selfish or not? We asked God to mold our ideals and help us to live up to them. We remembered always that our sex powers were God-given and therefore good, neither to be used lightly or selfishly, nor to be despised and loathed. Whatever our ideal turns out to be, we must be willing to grow toward it. We must be willing to make amends where we've done harm, provided that we do not bring about still more harm in so doing. In other words, we treat sex as we would any other problem. In meditation, we ask God what we should do about each specific matter. The right answer will come if we want it.
So having looked at the past, I can now form an ideal for my future. And it says to pray about it. And I might want to write this down. Now, what goes down here could be different for different people depending on their circumstance in life and their sexual orientation and all sorts of different things. And depending on a middle-aged married guy who wants to rebuild his marriage might put down certain things here, which could be a little bit different from a young single woman who got ideas about short-term relationships and other ideas about longer ones, which would be quite different from a nun. There are nuns and priests in AA. A nun might just put down, continue with my celibacy. I'm doing a great job, if that's the truth. It's always about putting down the truth. I'm not going to be really specific here, although we can be, but in my example here, I might say, well, in these relationships, I want to be honest. I want to be considerate of the other person or people. I want to be dependable. I want to be selfless. And above all, I want to be loving. So once again, there can be this uplifting exercise. I can look at the damage from the past and all those broken relationships, but then go, now that I'm on this new sober spiritual life, what does my higher power want me to bring, either to repair broken relationships or into new relationships as they form? Then it gives some advice.
God alone can judge our sex situation. Counsel with persons is often desirable, but we let God be the final judge. We realize that some people are as fanatical about sex as others are loose. We avoid hysterical thinking or advice. Suppose we fall short of the chosen ideal and stumble. Does this mean we are going to get drunk? Some people tell us so, but this is only a half truth. It depends on us and on our motives. If we are sorry for what we've done and have the honest desire to let God take us to better things, we believe we'll be forgiven and will have learned our lesson. If we are not sorry and our conduct continues to harm others, we are quite sure to drink. We are not theorizing, these are facts out of our experience. To sum up about sex, we earnestly pray for the right ideal, for guidance in each questionable situation, for sanity, and for the strength to do the right thing. If sex is very troublesome, we throw ourselves the harder into helping others. We think of their needs and work for them. This takes us out of ourselves. It quiets the imperious urge when to yield would mean heartache.
So there's the advice. And Bill keeps on going back. You've got a problem in life, go and help someone else.
Mm.
There's one last list we need to look at.
If we've been thorough about our personal inventory, we've written down a lot. We've listed and analysed our resentments. We've begun to comprehend their fertility and their fatality. We've commenced to see their terrible destructiveness. We've begun to learn tolerance, patience, and goodwill toward all men, even our enemies, for we look on them as sick people. We have listed the people we have hurt by our conduct and are willing to straighten out the past if we can.
So one last list. We need a list of people we've hurt along the way. In fact, when we get to step 8, it says in the book, we have a list of people we've harmed. We made it when we took inventory. So I want to make sure that we actually have this list at this point. This is probably the simplest list of all, because basically I'm just going to write down the name and then what the harm done was. And so how do I get this list? Again, I can refer back to my previous lists. Okay, put down Mrs. Jones. I was inconsiderate to her. My employer, I stole from him. My wife, I neglected her, made her worry about security. Notice I'm not going to put down Mr. Brown here, because when I look at what's happened, I haven't actually done anything to hurt Mr. Brown yet. That just shows that just because I've got a resentment against someone doesn't mean I owe them amends later on in steps 8 and 9. It's only those people that I've harmed along the way. My other list might prompt me to remember some other people. So my sister-in-law I stole from. My sex inventory will give me a bunch of names as well. My first girlfriend, Barry's girlfriend, and Barry, the girl from 1994, and the mistress. And then I can think, is there any other people along the way I've hurt that needs to be on this? Didn't show up in my resentment list. The hotel I stole from. My brother, I borrowed his watch when I was 10 years old and I broke it and put it back and never owned up it was me. And you think, who really cares? It's a $10 watch from all those years ago. But for some of us, that little secret that we've held, particularly about someone close to us, that little guilty secret, fact-finding, fact-facing, we put that down as well. Could be big things too, like the ex-work colleague that I blamed him for doing something I did and got him sacked. When it comes to making amends, that might be something I might need to really think about it. But at this moment, I'm not thinking about making amends. I'm just making the list. So he goes on my list. So that's what we have now. At the end of that process, 4 lists: resentments, fears, our sex conduct, and then the list of people we've harmed. At this point, it's very private. It's between me and a piece of paper and my higher power and nobody else. I might have discussed parts of it with a sponsor just to get clear on it, but really is a private thing and kept private. So one last reading out of the book.
In this book, you read again and again that faith did for us what we could not do for ourselves. We hope you are convinced now that God can remove whatever self-will has blocked you off from Him. If you have already made a decision and an inventory of your grosser handicaps, you've made a good beginning. That being so, you have swallowed and digested some big chunks of truth about yourself.
I like that. Once again, it reminds us why we're doing it. Sometimes we think, oh, we're doing this to find out why I drank in the first place. No, we're doing it to find out what's blocking me off from this connection that I'm seeking with this higher power, that decision I've made in the third step. And we've come a long way. We've swallowed and digested some big chunks of truth about ourselves, but it is a good beginning. The fourth step is just the beginning. There's more I need to do. So I can remember I ended up, after years of drinking and trying to stop and failing, I ended up, lost everything. The family had left. I'd lost my career. I was very sick. I was homeless. And I ended up, after a detox, in a halfway house, like a dry house in Bendigo, 6 guys living in a 3-bedroom house. And you weren't allowed to drink, and part of the rules were you have to go to AA. And that's where I got the identification and the understanding of the first step. I got the hope in the second step, and I made that decision I was going to jump in and do this. And I've been there about a month or so. The other guys in the house weren't as keen on AA as I was. One of them left, finished his 3 months and left, and I think he might still be sober. But the other 4 all relapsed, all one after the other, and were thrown out of the house. And I had nothing better to do than to sit down at the kitchen table in that little house and start taking inventory, which I did over a couple of days. And to me, when I finished it, this was a real accomplishment. In the 12 and 12, it says this is the first tangible evidence of our complete willingness to move on, because I've got a physical thing, a little exercise book with all my truth in it. And to me, that's the really amazing thing about it. Sure, I learned a whole lot about myself, but really the thing about actually holding it and thinking to myself, I've actually done this to the best of my ability. I've done something that I didn't really want to do, but I knew that the program and my higher power was suggesting that I needed to do in order to move forward. Remember, this whole exercise is a spiritual exercise. It's not an intellectual exercise, not a psychological exercise. I did plenty of therapy before that. I've had therapy afterwards to do with other things in my life. But this is not therapy. This is a spiritual exercise. So I need to be honest and I need to be fearless. Now, I'm not particularly honest and I'm not particularly fearless. That's why I actually find out more about how dishonest and full of fear I really am as I take this process. But that's why I need those first 3 steps first. That I need to know that I'm powerless, admit that I'm powerless, and I need to get that hope, and then make that decision to jump into this boots and all. The other thing, as Chris was saying, is about being thorough. And being thorough to me doesn't mean writing paragraphs and psychoanalyzing myself and psychoanalyzing the other people on my resentment list and all those types of things. Being thorough is that we don't leave anything out of the first column. If I leave some resentment, some fear, some harm's done, that's the thing that's likely to trip me up. So I need to be thorough. Don't leave anything out of the first column. The other thing to remember that this process is a very private thing. It's between me and a higher power and a piece of paper and nobody else at this point.
Or a computer.
Or you can do it as long as you make sure your computer's private. Yes. We don't make the decision about who we're going to do the next step with until after we've completed this one. And the other thing is keep it simple. Before I started, I thought, will this cover everything I need to cover? And because it looks too simple. But when I'd completed it, it just had all the information I needed then to move on with the rest of the steps. So there it is. Questions. We've been doing this quite a while, doing this in rehabs and stuff. We got lots of questions. Questions like, when do we take step 4? The answer was immediately after step 3. There's no break. There's nothing else in between. It's the result of taking step 3 that I jump in and take step 4. How long does it take? We suggest it should take hours and days, not weeks and months. This is a process that we do. We jump into it with vigorous action and be as honest and thorough and fearless as we can and just jump into it and do it. I was in a rehab. I had no job and no family, so I had no other demands on my time. But I understand if people have jobs, have families to look after those things, it might take some time. Okay, but it's about not putting it off any further, just jumping in and doing it, finding that time, still taking care of your responsibilities as well, but jumping in to do it. Once I've made this decision, there's little permanent effect unless I jump into this boots and all. How often do we take step 4? Our suggestion is once. I go into this process with the attitude that this is the one and only fourth step I'm ever going to take. Because if I have it in the back of my mind, I'll do some of it now, I'll do a bit more in 6 months' time, I'll do another one in 4 years' time when I'm ready for it, then that allows me to be dishonest and leave things out. I go into this with the intention of boots and all, everything's going in here. Now, we know later on in the program, we get to the 10th step and we do more inventory there. And sure, the inventory becomes part of our lives. But for me, I've only ever done one fourth step. That was the first one, that one. But I learned how to do inventory at the time. And of course, the next question is, what do we do next? And that's what we're going to talk about next week when we talk about step 5 and the rest of the 12-step program.
Great. Thanks, David. There's a lot of information there, but everything that you've seen here tonight is in the big book. Again, we don't make this stuff up. It's all there. It's all there to read. And we're very fortunate to be in Bendigo when we got sober, and we had a steps meeting. And I'd go to the steps meeting each week and I'd learn about how to do this by lots of members of Alcoholics Anonymous. People would share their experience. And because just one person to me wasn't enough. My sponsor didn't go through the book with me. I had lots of people I talked to. And a steps meeting was a really good way for me to actually see it in action. I'm one of those doing people. I don't get it when I read it, but when I see it in action and I actually do it, then it makes sense to me. So I hope you've enjoyed that one.
Where did you do it?
Where did I do it? I kept balking at it. And Wendy, my daughter, was still living with me at the time, and things weren't going well with that relationship. And so I said, oh, fuck it. I'm going to get a backpack and go up a mountain. And that's what I did. I went up a bit of a hill, really. I like to think it was a mountain. But I went up there and I just took my big book and the 12 and 12 and a little meditation book that I'd been given, and I prayed and I cried and I wrote it down, and I did it within a day. So I did my resentments, fears, sex conduct, and the harms done. And I did it to the best of my ability, and I got the effect. That's the thing. I didn't do it exactly the way it's done here tonight, but I did it to the best of my ability and I got the effect. And then over the years, I've learned how to carry this message on to other people in a bit of a clearer form than the way that I did it. But that's growth, and that's what we do. We grow in sobriety. And I've never done another 4-step, but I do 10 and 11 on a regular basis. And I get the effect. If you've had the effect, don't say, oh, I didn't do it exactly like that. I'll have to go back and do another 4-step. Don't do that. You got the information, you carry that forward. You pass that on to the people that you're around that need help as well.